Today on BRStv Investigates, these Reef breeders, Photon V2 Pluses, have a pretty slim profile and pretty slim price point, but how close to our LPS and SPS dominated tank goals will the Photon 24 and Photon 48 perform over a 24 and 48 inch tank respectively? Coming up, we show you what these Reef breeders Photon V2 Pluses is made of in a series of performance tests that you should consider not just for this light, but for any light fixture you're thinking of putting over your tank. Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we experiment on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And today we're using the Reef breeders Photon 24 and Photon 48 to light our 24 and 48 inch tanks respectively, to give those of you considering the Photon V2 Pluses some data-backed recommendations for how to set them up ideally and get the best performance possible over your own tank. To do that, we run a series of light tests that cover three main components to mastering any Reef lighting option over your tank, and those are mastering the light spread, light spectrum, and ideal par goals. Each light we test is uniquely different in how they perform within these three components, which is why it's important to test two Photon V2 Pluses and understand what type of performance you can expect from them if you choose to light your own tank with one. So what benefits do the Reef breeders Photons offer beyond their slick and slim design, variety of tank coverage size options using one single light that scales upwards of 50 plus inches, solid track record of happy reefers with amazing tanks, and relatively low cost price point? Well, if you stick around, we'll not only show you how to put these V2 Pluses to work at creating your own stunning tank full of rainbow colored LPS and fields of zoanthids, but with the right mounting height and setup, I'm going to show you how the Photon 24 at $400 winds up being one of the lowest cost ways to light an SPS filled 24 inch cube that we've tested yet. As I mentioned, that first main component to mastering your Reef light is to understand how well the Photon V2 Pluses spread the light across our tanks, and to help us determine that, there are three areas of light spread to consider. One, how many fixtures or modules would you need to adequately cover areas like our 24 square inches or common rectangle tanks like 48 by 24? Two, how high do we need to mount the lights to overcome hotspots directly under the light and evenly cover the most area possible? And three, if you need more than one light fixture to cover your tank area, how do you space them optimally to maintain an even spread across the tank while also lessening par hotspots where the lights intersect? There's one thing I personally like about lighting options like the Reef breeders Photon. It's that they already are designed to eliminate two of those consideration points to mastering light spread, meaning because the V2 Pluses are available in a different size option with coverage from 16 inches upwards of 50 inches, that first question of how many I need has already been answered by choosing the Photon that fits my tank size, while at the same time, that third question of how to optimally space multiple lights is also answered for even coverage. These are just two less things I need to worry about when dialing in my light fixture, leaving us with only one light spread question needing answered, and that's how high do we mount the Photon V2s for ideal light spread and distribution without too much light spilling into the surrounding room. To answer that question, we mounted a Photon 24 V2 Plus at a super low 6 inches above the water surface in our 24 cubed test area. Then we set all channels to 100%, took a grid of par measurements 6 inches deep in the tank, then raised the light inch by inch until we saw a reasonable reduction to the hotspot directly under the light, along with more par distributed to the outer edges. We stopped the test when we lost 15% or more of light efficiency due to light escaping outside of the tank and into the room. Let's take a look at that first 6 inch mounting height, where we see a substantial hotspot directly under the light at 888 average par, yet the average par in the outer edges is only 231. Thinking about how we would use this light in a real world tank environment, it's pretty obvious that a difference of 657 par 20 inches away in either direction is not the most ideal spread and even distribution, and because of that, it's easy to understand why we would want to mount the Photon 24 higher in order to optimize its performance. As I said, we tested tested the same grid of 36 par points while raising the light inch by inch and at 4 inches higher than our starting point. With the Photon now mounted at 10 inches off the water, we see a better performance already, where we've evened out that hotspot center to an average of 687 while picking up some par in the outer edges to 253. Although this is a major improvement from where we started, there's only a 7% loss of efficiency in the total average par between 6 inches and 10 inches, so we continue to test and improve the spread even further. After continuing this test, we stopped when we reached a mounting height of 13 inches off the top of the water, where we've improved the center hotspot to 594 and increased the outer par ring to 258. And because our goal is to stay under 15% threshold for light spill, we're calling a 13-inch mounting height for the Photon 24 V2 Plus, our BRS recommended mounting height for this 24-inch area. However, the next question is, will that same 13-inch recommendation hold true for a Photon LED at double the size? Let's find out using the Photon 48 V2 over our 48-inch tank. Using the Photon 48 mounted over our 4-foot test tank, we set out to verify that 13-inch mounting height recommendation. We started with it mounted at 6 inches above the water and then raised it up to 13 inches and tested again. Here we see at 6 inches there is a 902 center average par with just 123 outer average par, while at 13 inches the center has smoothed to 613 and we've improved that outer ring to 184. The difference here with the larger Photon 48 is that even at 13 inches we've only reached a 10% loss of efficiency, meaning this larger panel of LEDs we have room within our threshold to raise it higher and improve the performance. We found that peak performance mounting height at 16 inches off the top of the water, where we just reached that 15% threshold of light spill, but with a solid improvement in the center and outer average par, which tested at 536 and 202 respectively, making 16 inches our BRS recommended mounting height for this larger Photon V2 Plus over a 48 by 24 inch area. You heard me say today that there are 3 main components to mastering your reef lighting option, and now that we've shown you how to nail down that first component of light spread, we move on to the second component of mastering the spectrum for the Photon V2 Plus, which will help us make more informed adjustments that provide both for the optimal health and metabolic function in our corals, as well as create a tank that's awesome to look at. We do that with a look at 3 aspects of spectrum. First, in order to dial in the optimal spectrum output for the health of our corals, we need to know what the Reef Breeders Photon has to offer in individual controllable color channels. Once we know the spectrum output available to us, we can then use those individual channels and adjust them to create a recommended spectrum mix that we would use over a real-world reef tank. And for our third spectrum performance test, we mount the light over our test tank, set it to our recommended spectrum mix, and then use our spectrometer to determine how well the individual LED lenses and optimal mounting height blend that chosen spectrum together into one single uniform spectrum. So with that, let's cover that first aspect of mastering spectrum using the Reef Breeders Photon V2 Plus and see what it offers for individual spectrum ranges, where there are 6 controllable channels to choose from. Channel 1 is a deep red channel that we can see here has a peak at 663. Channel 2 offers a green channel that spikes at 520. Channel 3 is our royal blue channel at 447, where we typically see the most coral pop and coral fluorescence. Channel 4 is the white channel that maintains a peak at 445, but also includes some greens, yellows, and reds to make that white look to our eye. Channel 5 are cool blue LEDs targeted at the 459 nanometer range, and Channel 6 is that violet spectrum range that many call actinic, and actually with a peak at 417, this channel is very close to the same spectrum from an actinic T5 bulb. Now we need to use each of these individual color channels to create a recommended spectrum mix with the focus on achieving as wide of a blue spectrum band as possible between 400 and 500, and then compare that spectrum with the ATI Blue Plus bulb, which has been proven to successfully grow corals across hundreds and thousands of reefers' tanks in the past. In order to achieve that super wide blue band of spectrum, we jump straight to the royal blue, cool blue, and violet channels, turn them as high as they'll go. So for here, that's the channel 3, 5, and 6 set to 100%. Then we add in a little bit of white channel to make the tank more pleasing to look at with the eye, which means we set channel 4 to 50%. And finally, we round off the spectrum mix where we bring in a little green and red to accent the entire thing, meaning we've got channel 1 and 2 set to 10%. With these settings as our BRS recommended spectrum mix, let's see if we were able to achieve that wide blue band between 400 to 500. As we overlay the ATI Blue Plus spectrum on the left over our custom spectrum on the right, we see that both the royal blue and cool blue channels create a peak at 448, and with the violet channel focused on that 420 range, we can understand why the Photon Plus spectrum mix is a bit thinner than the Blue Plus bulb in that 420 to 440 range, and on the other side from 460 to 500. That's not to say that the spectrum mix isn't going to perform well in coral health and growth, because it still targets that spectrum range known for chlorophyll A, C, and carotenoid production. Next up for our spectral testing of the Reef Breeders Photon V2 is our test of spectrum blending, meaning in a real-world tank environment with ripples on the surface of the water that can cause focused beams of individual LED colors, we test to see how well the Photon maintains that blend of channels we just created. There are 10 spectrum testing measurements that we took underneath the 60-gallon cube with the Photon 24 mounted at the recommended 13 inches, and as we cycle through them, we see a pretty decent blending performance with only minimal fluctuations across the spectrum range as a whole. And one of the better performances that we've seen in this test, which I would attribute more to the higher optimal mounting height of the Photon, which gives it more space to blend the individual beams of color. So now that we've seen the performance for 2 of those 3 components to mastering reef lighting using the Reef Breeders Photon, there's only one question left to answer, and that is, how do we apply what we've learned from spread and spectrum to make smarter decisions on the right settings and intensity needed to achieve an awesome looking tank? For dialing in the right par from the Photon, we follow 2 common tank type desires. One tank type is filled with LPS, softies and polyps that typically have lower optimal par ranges between 75 to 150, while the other tank type is for SPS dominated systems where the goal is to fill the tank with par between 200 to 350. Using that BRS recommended spectrum mix, we adjust the spectrum ratio equally across the channels to increase or decrease the par as needed to meet these goals in both of our 24 cubed inch 60-gallon tank with a Photon 24 and our 48 by 24 inch 120-gallon tank with the Photon 48. Let's take a look at that smaller 24 by 24 inch cube first and trying to achieve those 75 to 150 par ranges throughout as much of the tank as possible, where we've mounted the Photon 24 at the recommended 13 inches and set our recommended spectrum mix to a 35% ratio of max, meaning greens and reds, channel 1 and 2 set to 3%, royal, light blue, and violet, channel 3, 5, and 6 set to 35%, and channel 4 whites set to 18%. Using these settings, we test 108 par data points between 6, 12, and 18 inches deep in the tank and find 77 out of 108 are within that 75 to 150 range for a total coverage of 71% from bottom to top, side to side. Next, we crank up that recommended spectrum mix and attempt to fill the tank in par ranges from 200 to 350 for those SPS dominated systems, using a spectrum mix ratio that is 85% of max, which has channel 1 and 2 at 9%, channel 3, 5, and 6 at 85%, and channel 4 at 43. At this 13-inch mounting height in our channel set to 85% of custom, we were only able to find 68 out of 108 data points in those par ranges, which only works out to be 63%, which is short of our 70% goal. We tried multiple adjustments to improve those numbers, both by adjusting the spectrum intensity and by different mounting heights, until we found that by sacrificing a bit more light spill into the room by raising the Photon 24 to 18 inches off the top of the water and setting our custom spectrum intensity to 100%, we were finally able to reach 78 out of 108 par points in that 200 to 350 range for a total of 72% of coverage throughout the tank. So as you can see, by adjusting the mounting height and sacrificing a little more light spill into the room, for anyone comfortable with some efficiency loss in order to gain par and spread, this $400 light can achieve a wall-to-wall SPS dominated tank at a lower cost than any single light module you've seen us test before. Now let's move on to getting the most out of our Photon 48 over our 48-inch tank and where it excels as a single lighting fixture option for this 4-foot area. Again, we mounted the light at the recommended 16 inches off the top of the water from our height test and set the overall channel spectrum intensity to a reduced 35% of max, with the goal in mind of filling the tank as much as possible in par numbers between 75 to 150 for those LPS and softy tank types. Using these settings and mounting height, we tested 133 out of 198 points within our par goal, which works out to be 67% of the entire tank optimized for those coral types. Although it's not the 70% we typically look for, if you look carefully at how many data points fell just slightly above or below that 75 to 150 range, the remaining 3% is really a matter of nitpicking plus or minus 10 par either way. As for attempting to fill the entire 4-foot tank with higher SPS dominated par numbers between 200 and 350, we set our recommended spectrum mix to 100% with the light mounted at 16 inches off the water, which yielded 110 out of 198 data points, or just 56% of the tank in those ranges. Again, it might be possible to improve those numbers slightly by raising the light higher. However, we're already at 100% of our recommended spectrum mix, and raising the light higher will start to reduce some of those data points to par levels outside of our target goal, at which point this turns into a game of fine-tuning whack-a-mole where you're just adjusting height and intensity to gain a few percentage points either way. So that said, I believe these Reef Breeders Photons excel for those reefers who are looking for one single light fixture to cover their entire tank, and will get the job done for most tank types, but does so in a more wallet-friendly type of way. For some reefers, a little bit of extra light spill in the room is perfectly fine if it means we can save a few bucks to get a slim, good-looking reef light that will certainly grow corals we desire to keep, whether it's hammers, torches, blastos or zoas, or even plating ephlos, branching green slimers, or other cool acropora or SPS. If light spill isn't something that you want to add to your room, but you still want to use the photons for your own tank, just keep in mind the data that you saw today and use it to make smarter coral choices and coral placement decisions, and verify that you got it right using a par meter. The next question is, now that you're more informed on how to master your coral's lighting needs using the Photon V2 Pluses, what other parts of the tank can you expand on and master, and then put it all together into a tank that your friends and family can drool over? I think the next best thing you can do to master your tank is to master the water and chemistry within it, which Ryan shows you how to do next right over here.